Parliament and King George III's stance towards the American colonies remained unchanged in 1767, notwithstanding the now repealed Stamp Act. Massive war debts continued to drag the empire down. So, Chancellor Charles Townshend devised a new way to raise revenue from the American colonies. Rising half drunk on champagne, Townshend delivered a striking speech in the House of Commons on May 8, 1767. Unabashed gossip Horace Walpole would write, quote, "He returned about 8 in the evening, half drunk with champagne and more intoxicated with spirits." Earning the posthumous nickname Champagne Charlie, his proposal would be known as the Townshend Acts. Now, the acts were founded on the premise that the colonies would be amendable to an external, indirect tax rather than an internal, direct tax, as was the case with the Stamp Act. Glass, lead, tea, paper, paint, among others, were the many products that had to be imported from Britain according to the Revenue Act of 1767. Which was approved by Parliament in June of that year. An insult to the colonists, the design was stubbornly archaic. Anger over the Sugar Act was still fresh, and the Stamp Act had barely just been repealed. What made Bostonians even more furious was that the Townshend revenues would be used to pay the salaries of Crown officials and support British troops flooding into the province. This would further remove the governor, Francis Bernard, the lieutenant governor and chief justice, Thomas Hutchinson, and their loyalist colleagues from any accountability to the people. Additional tax collection authority was granted to the now Boston-based American Board of Custom Commissioners by a distinct statute. The fact that the colonies were not involved in making the decision was the most venomous aspect to them. In imposing this new tax and setting up the enforcement and judicial machinery in the Board of Customs Commissioners, London had completely sidestepped the provincial assembly. It was not the sum, but the principle that was contested. Mercy Otis Warren recorded in her history. For many colonists who were not already convinced, the Townshend Acts and ensuing events made it plain that the mother country was indeed a greedy master whose last concern was the well-being of her citizens. In response to the Townshend Acts, which would take effect November 20th, 1767, one man penned an anonymous series of 12 open letters that argued respectfully but vehemently against these new taxes, setting off a firestorm in the American colonies against the Crown. Hello, history friends. My name is Lisa, and this is Historical USA. Here, we discover the people, places, and events that have made America. Now, in this episode, we are going to talk about a man that would be later known as the penman of the American Revolution. Now, I think some people would equate that nickname with Thomas Paine, and we will talk about Thomas Paine at some point in this series. But by 1767, Thomas Paine has not even set foot on America's shores. The person we are talking about is a forgotten founder, John Dickinson. Now, John Dickinson will have a huge impact on the American Revolution. He will be the author of the Olive Branch Petition, the first system of government in America, the Articles of Confederation, but it is his first work that will be printed in the newspapers that will set off a chain reaction among patriots and activists all throughout the colonies for the next decade. Now, John Dickinson was born November of 1732, in the colony of Maryland. His family was outstanding Quakers and wealthy tobacco farmers. Now, sometime during John's youth, his father was disfellowed from the Quaker Church for allowing his daughter to marry outside the Quaker faith. Though John would not become a Quaker himself, he would draw many of his morals from these Quaker beliefs throughout his life, as evidenced by his ideas and writings. Now, he was encouraged by his father Samuel, who was also a judge in Delaware, to enter the law. At 18, John was sent to study under Philadelphia lawyer John Morton, a future signer of the Declaration of Independence, and there he would become friends with George Read, another signer of the Declaration of Independence. Now, in 1754, Dickinson was sent to Britain to study at the illustrious Middle Temple. He would return to Philadelphia in 1757 and soon be admitted to the Philadelphia bar. It was shortly after the beginning of his law career that his father, Samuel, had died, and John inherited part of the Kent County estate, a plantation known as Poplar Hill. Now, in 1760, he assumed the responsibility of running the farm as an absentee landlord, as he remained in Philadelphia. The same year of his father's passing, John was elected as a member of the Delaware Assembly. This is important because 2 years later, he would also be elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, positions he had held in tandem for 4 years. That is until Dickinson stood against Benjamin Franklin. Now, at the time, Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony, meaning that the colony was governed by a Lord Proprietor. In this case, the Penn family. Benjamin Franklin did not like this. He was absolutely disgusted by the unscrupulous behavior of William Penn's descendants. He hoped that the colony would fare better under the king and Parliament's control rather than the Penn family, who, according to Franklin, shared none of William Penn's political and religious beliefs. While John Dickinson was not particularly fond of the Penns, he did express his opposition to Benjamin Franklin's proposal. Quote, "If the charge of government now mediated can take place with all our privileges preserved, let it instantly take place. But if they must be consumed in the blaze of royal authority, we shall pay too high a price." In his speeches opposing Benjamin Franklin's plan, John Dickinson is revealed to be a Whiggish, remember that term, anti-Tory idealist of both William Penn's and John Locke's political philosophy. He would become great friends with James Otis. Now, these speeches, which articulated principles to which John Dickinson remained committed throughout his life, earned him the respect and admiration of his contemporaries, who also believed in those Whiggish ideas, which we've talked about a little more earlier in the podcast with the rise of King George III. And if you want to check out that video, I will post a link in the description, or you want to listen to that episode, the link will be in the description bar below. Well, Dickinson's opposition to Benjamin Franklin and Franklin's plan caused a divide in the Pennsylvania Assembly. The 1764 elections became very divisive, and Franklin's faction won the majority, which ultimately forced Dickinson out of the Pennsylvania Assembly. Dickinson is often referred to as the penman of the Revolution. Now, he would write a series of pamphlets and essays that would ignite the flames of revolution throughout the colonies. During the Stamp Act Congress of 1765, it was Dickinson who was tasked with writing the Declarations of Rights and Grievances, which were sent to the King of England. This address was the first official document drawn up and agreed upon by a combination of American colonies. Never mind the fact that the king and Parliament barely read it. But Dickinson then published a pamphlet called The Late Regulations Respecting the British Colonies. In them, Dickinson argued that trade regulations would have a significant impact on Britain and the colonies, and that America's trade should become and remain independent. Now, if that wasn't enough, he then furthers this argument in a popular and influential series of essays titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Now, his letters would essentially, in modern terms, go viral. They wouldn't just be printed in Delaware and Pennsylvania. They would be printed all along the eastern seaboard and would inspire other pamphlets and essays against the crown. After Britain imposed the Townshend Acts, Dickinson took to his pen in protest. The Letters from a Farmer were a series of 12 letters that set out the colonial argument opposing British taxation more clearly and persuasively than any previous work. Now, on December 2nd, 1767, the Pennsylvania Chronicle published the first of a series of letters signed Just a Farmer. The letters were published weekly and ran until February of 1768. In the Founding Fathers' style, Dickinson had written these letters anonymously, but the authorship would soon become known. I mean, he would send copies of the letters to a lot of his friends, including James Otis, before they would be published. Dickinson eventually becomes one of the most famous Americans in the world, second only to his rival, Benjamin Franklin. The letters maintained that the colonists, as British subjects, had the right not to be taxed without the consent of lawmakers elected by them, i.e., no taxation without representation. They also contended that the Townshend duties, or acts, as the acts were sometimes referred to, were taxes because they were imposed to raise revenue rather than to regulate behavior. Thus, only the colonists' elected legislatures could impose them on Americans. Parliament, where Americans were unrepresented, could not. This is such a huge focus of the patriot cause, this no taxation without representation. If you've listened to this podcast, I have mentioned this almost in every single episode because Sam Adams, James Otis, John Adams, John Dickinson, they all have the same argument. Patrick Henry. I mean, this is an overreach of their rights as British citizens. This taxation without representation. In the letters, Dickinson is mainly arguing the legality of the acts. However, he does express much concern for the natural rights of man, writing, quote, "We cannot be happy without being free. We cannot be free without being secure in our property. We cannot be secure in our property if, without our consent, others may take it away." John Dickinson's letters were then published as a pamphlet and distributed throughout the colonies, as well as Britain and France. His words caught on like wildfire in the colonies, making him one of the most famous people in America. Benjamin Franklin introduced his letters to the people of Britain under a different title called The General Sentiments of Americans. Franklin also wrote of the letters, quote, "I hope this publication will produce a full answer if we can make one. If it does, this publication will have had its use. No offense to government is intended by it, and it is hoped none will be taken," end quote. After reading the letters, Voltaire, the French enlightened philosopher, compared Dickinson to Cicero, a revered Roman statesman, orator, and philosopher. Now, I would argue, and I think it's very evident, that Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer was one of, if not the most important publications to the cause of American independence. Probably more so than Thomas Paine. They would spark protests and petitions throughout the colonies and inspire other essays and writings by patriots such as James Otis, Samuel Adams, and John Adams. Sam Adams spoke of Dickinson by saying, quote, that the thanks of the town be given to the ingenious author of A Course of Letters, signed a farmer, wherein the rights of American subjects are clearly stated and fully vindicated, end quote. Now, Dickinson would go on to write more documents and publications, but one that I find really interesting, and if you've watched the John Adams miniseries, it's actually in the series. Dickinson also composed a song that became very popular in his day. It was titled The Liberty Song, set to a tune of a British seafaring song, Heart of Oak. Now, the lyrics first appear in the Boston Gazette in 1768. Dickinson had lit a fire he could not control. And, sadly, as rebellion against the crown would be amplified, leading to the First and Second Continental Congress, Dickinson, instead of becoming more of a rebel, grew more moderate, calling for a redress of grievances through constitutional means. And we will examine the Olive Branch Petition and learn more of John Dickinson's story in future episodes. But for right now, I want to celebrate the inspiration that John Dickinson gave to many of our founding fathers and patriot leaders in establishing the United States. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and like I said, we will see more of Dickinson. His story is not done, but the rest of his story is for another episode. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click that like button. That really helps me out in the algorithm so much. I just want to shout out our Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel and supporting the work we do here on Historical USA. For those of you in the book club, make sure that you are checking Patreon so that you can vote for next month's book. If you want to join the book club, the link is down below. It is free to join the book club. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can sign up for a membership tier over there. Thank you guys so much. We will see more of Dickinson. I'm really excited about it because Dickinson is definitely one of my favorite founding fathers. He has seen everything. His signature might not be on everything. If you know, you know, but he's seen everything. So he's a great one to study. Thank you guys so much. Have a nice night. Bye.
Steady, boys, steady. Merci pour la Révolution américaine. Oui, merci, monsieur. Madame. Mr. Adams, give one there.
No, but he did not pay.
All right. Thank you, merci, merci.
No.
Merci. Yes.
Take his money.
Merci, monsieur. La Révolution, money, liberté. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we live. Merci, merci. Steady, not as safe, but